The walk-in freezer door swung shut behind Theo Basset, and for a moment he just stood there in the cold, letting it close over him like a hand pressing down. He had done it again. Made something no one asked for. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of gray-skied afternoon that settled over Vancouver like a wet coat, and Brasserie Longueuil was already halfway through its dinner prep when Theo, Dishwasher, 23 years old, the youngest of 5 and the only one who had ever left Chicoutimi, had slipped a small pot onto the back burner during his break. A short rib braise, reduced stock, a mirepoix he'd trimmed from vegetable scraps destined for the compost, dried thyme he kept in a Ziploc in his locker. Nothing fancy, nothing that cost the restaurant a cent. He had done this before quietly in the margins of the kitchen's attention, a mushroom consommé, a potato gratin that 2 line cooks had eaten without asking where it came from, small things. His own education paid for in scrap and patience. He wasn't supposed to be at that stove, he knew that. What he hadn't expected was for Chef Laurent Foy to walk in at exactly the wrong moment. Foy was not the kind of man who entered a room. He occupied it, 48 years old, silver at the temples, 2 toques from Chatelaine and a profile in Food and Drink magazine that his sous-chef had laminated and taped inside the dry storage cupboard as a joke Foy pretended not to find funny. He had trained in Lyon, staged in Tokyo, and had run Brasserie Longueuil for 11 years with the particular certainty of a man who had never seriously been wrong about anything in a kitchen. He stopped when he saw Theo standing at the back burner. The expression on his face didn't change immediately. That was the thing about Foy. His anger was never loud at first. It assembled itself slowly, the way a storm builds pressure before the first crack of lightning. "What," Foy said, "are you doing?" It wasn't a question. The period was audible. Theo turned. The ladle was still in his hand. "I'm on my break, chef. I was just—" "You were just." Foy crossed the kitchen floor in 4 steps. He looked into the pot. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was deciding something. "Short rib." "Yes, chef." "With what stock?" "I saved the bones from yesterday's trim. I didn't take anything from—" "You saved the bones." Foy said it the way you might repeat back something a child had said, with a patience designed to humiliate. "You went into my kitchen scraps and made yourself a little project." The line cooks had gone quiet. No, this wasn't the video, there was no Marcus here. The prep cook near the guard manger station had found something urgent to chop. Everyone had found something urgent. No one looked at Theo. "It's a braise," Theo said. "It's just a braise I was going to clean up before service." Foy picked up the pot. He did it casually, the way you'd pick up a coffee mug. He carried it across the kitchen to the sink and poured it down the drain. Every drop. The smell rose up briefly. Rich, mahogany dark, the kind of smell that should have made someone stop and ask, and then it was gone. The drain took it without comment. "The dish pit," Foy said, setting the empty pot on the counter without looking at Theo, "is in the back. That's where you work. That's where your equipment is. The stoves belong to my cooks, not to the boy who scrapes plates." Theo didn't move. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, chef." "Good." Foy adjusted his jacket. "If I find you at my stoves again, I'll end your shift permanently, not just tonight, permanently." He walked away. The kitchen came back to life around Theo like a held breath released. The clatter of hotel pans, the hiss of the flat top, someone calling a ticket, normal, seamless, as though nothing had happened. Theo went back to the dish pit. He stood at the machine, feeding in racks of glasses, and he thought about his grandmother's hands. Marguerite Basset had cooked for 40 years out of a house in Chicoutimi, with a kitchen the size of a bathroom, a gas range with 1 broken element, and a notebook she kept in the drawer under the phone. The notebook was green, the cover warped from steam and years of being grabbed with damp hands. She had started it when she was 22 and added to it until the year she died, when Theo was 16. Every recipe she'd ever made was in there, in her particular handwriting, a mix of French and English that no one else in the family could fully parse, with margin notes that said things like "more salt than you think" and "don't rush the onions," and "this one is for people you love, not people you're trying to impress." Theo had the notebook. It lived in his apartment on Commercial Drive, in a Ziploc bag because he was terrified of water damage, on the shelf above his hot plate. He had been cooking from it since he was 12. He had never told anyone at Brasserie Longueuil about it. He had never told anyone that he had been feeding his family since his mother's second back surgery, that he had learned to stretch a chicken carcass across 3 meals, that by 15 he could break down a whole animal and had opinions, real, considered opinions, about the difference between braising low and slow versus hard and short. He was the dishwasher. That was the information available. That was the container he'd been poured into. He went home that night and didn't cook. He sat on his floor with a beer and the notebook open in his lap and looked at a recipe for tourtière that his grandmother had annotated with a small drawing of a leaf in the margin. He had no idea why the leaf was there. He had never figured it out. It made him smile in the complicated way that grief sometimes does, like something catching. He thought, I should leave. He thought, I've been thinking that for 8 months. He thought about the rent. He stayed. The next 3 months at Brasserie Longuet were unremarkable, which was its own kind of message. Foy didn't speak to Theo directly again unless it was to point out a rack of glasses that hadn't been fully cleared or a floor that needed a second pass. The line cooks, most of them, had forgotten the incident with the braise the way people forget anything that doesn't affect them personally. Theo was part of the furniture, reliable, invisible, present. But things had shifted in the small, important ways that only the person inside the shift can feel. He started writing in the margins of his grandmother's notebook. Not her recipes, he wouldn't touch those, but his own notes in a different pen, carefully distinguished. Things he noticed during service. The way Foy built acidity into a sauce differently than the notebook suggested. The way the fish prep was wasteful in ways that bothered him. A broth he'd been developing mentally for weeks, based on a technique Marguerite had used but pushed further. Longer extraction, different aromatics, a finish he could see clearly in his head but hadn't made yet. He made it in his apartment on a Tuesday night on his single hot plate. He ate it standing over the pot in his socks. It was the best thing he had ever made. He wrote 3 pages of notes about it, numbered adjustments, a final version of the recipe, and then he put the notebook away and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about what it meant that something you made alone, in a kitchen the size of a closet, on equipment that didn't work properly, could be better than anything you'd eaten at a two-toke restaurant, where everything cost money and everything was done right. He thought it meant something. He wasn't sure what yet. The competition was called the Laurier Prize, and Theo found out about it from a flyer taped to the bulletin board in the staff room at Brasserie Longuet, half covered by a schedule change. It was an annual competition for emerging culinary talent in the province. Open entry, no formal culinary school requirement, 1 dish judged blind. He stood in front of the flyer for a long time. Behind him, one of the line cooks came in, poured coffee, glanced at what he was reading. You should enter, the cook said, and then paused when she realized who she was talking to. Corrected herself without correcting herself. I mean, anyone could. It's open. She left. Theo entered. He didn't tell anyone at the restaurant. He didn't tell his family in Chicoutimi, who would have asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. He submitted his application on a Thursday evening from his phone, sitting in his van outside a Tim Hortons because the Wi-Fi was better there than in his building. And then he sat with the confirmation email open on his screen for a while before putting his phone away and driving home. The dish he planned to make was the broth, the one from his hot plate, from Marguerite's technique, pushed into something he didn't have a name for yet. He had 8 weeks. He worked on it the way his grandmother had worked on things, not frantically but steadily. Every adjustment documented, every failure analyzed without drama. He blew a significant portion of his grocery budget on short ribs and aromatics and started over twice. Once because the extraction wasn't right. Once because he got the finish wrong and it tasted of effort, which was the one thing a dish must never taste of. By week 6, he had a version he trusted. By week 7, he was refining presentation, because the Laurier Prize was blind on name and background, but not on the plate. He bought a single white bowl at a second-hand shop on Main Street. He practiced plating in his apartment until he could do it in under 45 seconds without thinking. He thought about Marguerite constantly, about the notebook, about the leaf in the margin, about the note that said this one is for people you love, not people you're trying to impress. He decided the broth was for her, which meant it was for people who deserved something real, people who would eat it and feel something they couldn't quite name. The night before the competition, he sat at his kitchen table with the notebook open and read through the original recipe one more time. Marguerite's handwriting, the smudge near the bottom of the page that he had always assumed was cooking oil. The word patience underlined twice, for no reason she had ever explained to him. He closed the notebook carefully. He put it back in its Ziploc bag. He went to bed. The Laurier Prize was held in a culinary facility at a downtown hotel, and Theo arrived by bus, carrying his mise-en-place in a cooler bag he had borrowed from his neighbor. He wore a clean white chef's coat he had ordered online 2 weeks prior, the first one he had ever owned, and he stood in the registration line behind people who had gone to SAIT and George Brown and the Pacific Institute of Culinary Arts, people who talked about their stages and their instructors and their techniques, and he looked at his shoes and said nothing and thought about his grandmother's kitchen. He was assigned Station 14. He cooked. He did not think about the other stations. He did not think about Foy or Brasserie Longueuil or the pot that had gone down the drain. He thought only about what the broth needed, and when it needed it, and what it would say to the person who tasted it. He finished plating with 2 minutes to spare. The bowl went onto the judging cart. He cleaned his station. He sat in the waiting area with the other competitors and drank bad coffee from a paper cup and did not speak to anyone, and was completely entirely calm, which surprised him, because he had expected to be afraid. He wasn't afraid. He had made something true. Whether or not it won, it was true. His grandmother had taught him to cook, and he had cooked, and whatever happened next would happen. He won. He found out 3 weeks later by email, on his lunch break at Brasserie Longueuil, sitting on an overturned milk crate outside the back door in the cold. He read the email twice. Then he sat with his phone in his lap and watched a seagull walk across the parking lot with the particular self-possession of an animal that had never doubted its right to be somewhere. The Laurier Prize carried a cash award. It also carried something that mattered more, the attention of 3 food journalists, 2 of whom ran significant publications, and a write-up in a culinary newsletter that reached, as Theo would later learn, approximately 14,000 subscribers. The headline read, "Laurier Prize winner has no formal training," and the judges couldn't stop talking about his broth. The write-up mentioned that the winning contestant was a kitchen worker at a Vancouver restaurant. It mentioned the recipe's apparent influences: rustic, technique-forward, a profound understanding of extraction that you would expect from someone who had spent decades in professional kitchens. It mentioned that the judges had asked, upon seeing the contestant, whether there had been an error in the record. There had not been an error. Theo read the article standing in the dish pit at Brasserie Longueuil on his phone between racks. He had found it because someone had texted him a link, one of the line cooks, the one who had told him anyone could enter. The text said only, "Is this you?" He typed back, "Yeah." She sent a string of exclamation marks. Laurent Foy did not find out that morning. He found out 4 days later, when the food journalist from Appetite West called the restaurant to request a comment from the establishment where the Laurier Prize winner was employed. The person who answered was the reservations manager, who had no idea what the journalist was talking about and put her on hold and found Foy in the kitchen and said, in the careful tone of someone delivering news whose shape they don't fully understand, "Chef, there's someone on the phone asking about an award for someone named Theo Basset." Foy said, "Put it through to my office." He spoke to the journalist for 3 minutes. He came back into the kitchen and looked at Theo, who was at the dish pit. Theo looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. Service continued. That night after close, Foy came to find Theo while he was doing his final sanitizing pass. The kitchen was empty except for the 2 of them, the overhead lights at half power, the hum of the walk-in. Foy stood at the edge of the dish pit with his arms crossed. "The short rib braise," he said. "Yes, chef." "Was that the same technique?" "Related," Theo said. "The competition dish was further developed." Foy was quiet for a moment. "You've been cooking since when?" "Since I was about 12. Another pause. "Where did you learn?" "My grandmother." Theo dried his hands on a side towel. "She had a notebook. She'd been cooking out of it for 40 years. Foy looked at him for a long time. Not with guilt. Theo didn't expect guilt, and didn't want it. With something closer to assessment. The same look he gave a sauce when he wasn't sure yet what it needed. "You should have told me," Foy said finally. "I tried to show you," Theo said. "You poured it down the drain." Foy said nothing. Theo picked up his bag. "I appreciate the work," he said. I'm going to give my notice in writing tomorrow. I've had a few conversations this week. There's a small place on Powell that needs a sous chef. They've read the article. He paused at the edge of the kitchen. I think I'm ready to cook somewhere that wants me to cook. He left through the back door. The cold hit him as it always did. Sudden, clarifying, the kind of air that makes everything feel very simple. He pulled his jacket on and walked to his bus stop and stood under the shelter with 3 other people who were also waiting, also cold, also going somewhere. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the notebook and the leaf in the margin he had never understood, and the note that said, "This one is for people you love." He had figured out, somewhere in the past year, that the leaf was probably just a leaf, a thing she had picked up outside and pressed between the pages and forgotten about. Not a symbol, just a small piece of the world she had carried in with her. He liked that better than a symbol. The bus came. In the years that followed, Theo Basset became known in Vancouver's culinary community for a particular quality that critics struggled to name precisely. Something in the restraint of his cooking, a way of making something simple taste like it had been waiting its whole life to be exactly what it was. He won a second award 2 years after the Laurier Prize. He was profiled in Vancouver magazine. He started a monthly Sunday supper at his restaurant, a low-cost community meal, pay what you can, specifically for people in the restaurant industry who couldn't afford to eat at the places they worked. He named it after his grandmother. He kept her notebook in a glass case in the kitchen, visible but protected. New cooks, when they started, sometimes asked about it. He always told them the same thing. A woman in Chicoutimi who had a broken stove and a green notebook taught me everything that actually mattered. The rest I figured out in someone else's dish pit. He never once said the rest without knowing what it cost. Laurent Foy's restaurant closed 3 years after Theo left. Not dramatically, not in scandal, but in the slow, grinding way that restaurants close when a city's appetite moves on and the person in charge can't figure out why. The review that preceded the closure wasn't cruel. It said the food was technically accomplished, but somehow no longer said anything. Theo read it once and didn't read it again. He had a service to run. There is a particular kind of talent that the world is very bad at recognizing because it doesn't arrive in the right container. It comes in through the back door, wearing the wrong clothes, doing the work no one else wants to do. And the people who should know better look at the container and make their decision before they have ever tasted what's inside. What Theo Basset understood, what Marguerite Basset had taught him long before he had words for it, is that a recipe is not just a list of ingredients and steps. It is a record of attention, of care, paid out in hours, of someone standing at a stove and refusing to be careless about the thing in front of them. You can pour that down a drain, but you can't unmake it. I keep thinking about that green notebook, the warped cover, the smudge near the bottom of one page that Theo never could explain. A woman spent 40 years putting everything she knew into those pages, not for fame, not for anyone's approval, just because she cared deeply about doing something right. And then she passed it to a boy who carried it across a province in a Ziploc bag because he was afraid of water damage. That's not a small thing. That's everything. What I've come to understand, watching stories like Theo's, is that the world makes a particular kind of mistake very consistently. It looks at where someone is standing and decides that's all they are. Dispit, back of house. No credentials, no pedigree, no formal kitchen training. And so the person in front of you becomes invisible, not because they've done anything wrong, but because the container doesn't match what you were taught to look for. Laurent Foy wasn't stupid. He was just certain, and certainty, when it hardens into habit, stops being a skill and starts being a wall. The broth Theo made that Tuesday, the one that went down the drain, was already the thing it would become. Foy's decision didn't change what was in the pot. It just meant he'd never know. I think about that when I think about integrity. Not the word on a motivational poster, but the actual practice of it. Doing the careful, honest work, even when no one is watching, even when the person above you just told you it was garbage. Theo kept his grandmother's notebook. He kept writing his own notes in a different pen, carefully distinguished. He kept developing a recipe on a hot plate in a one-room apartment with a budget that couldn't absorb many mistakes. That's not stubbornness. That's a person who knows the difference between someone else's opinion and the truth of the thing they're making. And the intelligence it took. Not cleverness, not quick answers, but the real kind of understanding that comes from years of paying attention. knowing when a broth tastes of effort, knowing when to start over, knowing that a dish must never taste like the struggle it cost. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from a classroom. It comes from someone who loved you standing at a stove and showing you what it looks like to care about what you put in front of people. What stays with me, honestly, is the bus ride home after Foy poured the broth away. Theo didn't quit that night. He went home, he sat with the notebook, he looked at a drawing of a leaf he'd never understood. He let himself feel it, and then he got up the next day and went back to work and kept going. That quiet persistence, that refusal to let someone else's contempt become your own, that might be the hardest thing in the world to hold on to. And it might also be the only thing that actually moves you forward. You can pour something down a drain. You can't unmake what a person knows.